So we're going to introduce our next speaker. We've got Philip McNaughton. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. Philip's from Face, and he's talking about co-creation and inverting the research and innovation process. So thank you.
Thanks. So yeah, today is my first anniversary of living in America. It's my American birthday. So here I am in Cincinnati and MRMW, and what better place to spend my birthday than here? So thank you very much for inviting me. Oh, no, I'm serious. I'm going to talk a bit about co-creation, and as I've kind of boldly put on the title of this presentation, inverting the research and innovation process. And I've spent the morning kind of working out what my title means, sitting here. And I think I've got it. So I think I want to talk about two things today. And I'm actually going to explain a couple of things about my title before I kind of get into it. And the first thing is kind of like this idea of inverting the research and innovation process. And I guess the kind of question is why would we or might we want to invert the research and innovation process? And I think actually it comes back to a couple of things that were sparked by your presentation, Jason's presentation this morning. Which is around really the need for speed of insight, an increasing need for speed of insight, an increasing need for speed of insight without losing the quality of the insight, and the increasing need for speed of insight and quality of insight in the changing world that we live in. And I think that challenge that's set up for the industry, speed, quality, changing world, actually creates this need for inverting the research and innovation process. And there's lots of ways we can think about changing that, but my agency believes that co-creation is one of them. And the second thing I'm going to explain is around co-creation. I guess kind of it's a term that's around, and people have different interpretations of it, and hopefully in this presentation I'm going to talk about my agency's interpretation of it, and hopefully kind of bring a big thought around co-creation. But if you'd asked me 5 years ago what it meant, I would very much have kind of said, well, it's about creating products with consumers. It's about getting in clients and consumers together in the same room. You might have talked a little bit about crowdsourcing and some of the open innovation platforms that brands are running. But we at Face actually think there's a bigger thought behind it, and that thought is around co-creation as an idea which is designed to invert the research and innovation process for quality and speed of insight in a changing world. I do actually have some other slides. You'd be pleased to hear. I don't have any detailed technology to show you. I don't have any case studies to show you. I've just got some big picture thinking around co-creation. And if you don't like that, I've got some pretty pictures and nice big words, so you can just get into those. I know this is going to be really hard to kind of read at the back, but I love this cartoon. As someone that ran focus groups for many years. And I'll read it out, because if you can't see it at the back, it's not worth me showing it. We've got this client climbing this mountain and saying, oh, all-knowing focus group, tell me your unmet needs, consumer needs, so we can create disruptive innovations for you. And the consumers say back, more promotions, make everything cheaper. And I think kind of that is sort of that idea of kind of how qualitative research particularly has been used in innovation kind of traditionally is kind of seen. It's kind of just feels very dull and kind of very passive, and this is the kind of things you get back, promotions, and make it all cheaper. So that's the kind of sense that of something that we're kind of fighting against. I think just to take a step back, some of the context, I'm not going to go on about pace of change in kind of the world that we live. Jason very eloquently talked about velocity of information, and we all know what difference technology is making. But I think there's a couple of other things that are important in terms of pace of change that I think are relevant to this whole debate around the research and innovation process. That's more than just around velocity of information. And I think the first of that is the competitive context that a lot of categories are operating in is changing very, very rapidly. So we do work with finance companies. Increasingly, finance companies are finding their competitors aren't other finance companies, they're technology companies. Take the example of Visa or MasterCard operating in payment space. Suddenly they're competing with Facebook. Take pharmaceutical companies. Pharmaceutical companies, it's been all about medication. Suddenly they're having to be technology companies. So I think there's a lot of context around change in terms of categories, blending, merging together and shifting that is creating pace of change, new landscapes, new ecosystems for companies to live in. And as they're entering those new ecosystems, that's increasingly the challenge in terms of the speed and quality of insight they get to navigate these new landscapes. We also, as we all know, participatory culture that we live in more these days, not just in terms of marketing, but in terms of pop culture and even in terms of government. So we live in a world that does feel more participatory. And I think also this is a kind of big, bold kind of statement, really, but I think we're also leaving the era of kind of monolithic brands, very much that command and control, very strong sense of pushing out their messages to different audiences from a very fixed point of view. And we've kind of moved on from that time to a much more kind of agile idea of branding. The central brand DNA might be the same, but the way they have to activate and engage with the world and the world of consumers has changed and having to be much more agile. And I think accompanying that is an end of an ivory tower mentality. I hope the ivory tower idea translates here. The idea that kind of we as brands know best. We know what to create. We know how to sell that. And I think that ivory tower mentality is shifting and changing too. And just quickly, I won't kind of go into the deep. This is my most technical slide. It looks very kind of molecular. But really what this is kind of designed to show is that point around how, particularly in terms of social media and earned media spaces, are changing the way that brands and consumers interact, much more shared spaces between the two rather than that idea of brands pushing out. And brands increasingly have to be much more social. So all of that is kind of some context which leads to the bigger point around research and innovation, which is the opportunity and the potential, indeed the need for a more active role for consumers as influencers. And a bigger thought that sits behind that is this idea of doing things with people and not at people, whether that be in a research environment or a marketing environment or an activation environment, doing things with people, not at people. And I think the way I always try and articulate this is actually seeing consumers as people who can influence us as brands, rather than just people we want to influence. So creating some sense of dialogue. And I think we kind of know that that's kind of there. So where am I going with all of this? I want to kind of step back to 5 years ago again, where I talked about my definition of co-creation, and what it meant was very much a workshop environment. Could be some kind of crowdsourcing, as I said, where it's about, well, let's get out from behind the mirror, let's actually get consumers and clients together, creating together, and usually kind of that was around product concepts. So 5 years ago, all the work my agency did was really around a lot of CPG work, actually about creating concepts, creating product ideas with consumers. And over the last 5 years, we've seen that product, if you like, co-creation, which was quite new and innovative 5 years ago, becoming increasingly commoditized. Every qualitative agency, particularly the boutique agencies you see, will have a tab on their website which says co-creation. And it's all about product innovation, all about workshops. So how can we kind of move on from that? Because I think there is definitely scope for moving on. And at Face, we talk about having, well, hopefully a more ambitious model around co-creation. And I think, again, this plays into some of the things that you were talking about, Jason. That's why I've kind of you helped me work out what my presentation was going to be about, so thank you. And I think where we're kind of going with this is that if you go back 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, apart from kind of in the most enlightened companies, the way that companies created value with their brands, with their products, with their communications, and with their marketing was very typically to sit in a room with a small group of people, maybe sweating it out with their advertising agency, and creating ideas internally, and then progressively testing those ideas with more and more people as they kind of went along. Maybe we might do it qualitatively, maybe we might do it quantitatively. And I think what happens when we do that, and why this model has changed, is that you tend to get very static and fixed ideas. It's quite expensive to do, and it takes a long time. And what happens very often is you kind of lose the insight along the way. And so I've worked with so many companies that talk about having to back code insight onto the ideas they've created or the agencies they've given them. Oh, we've got an insight in this drawer, we'll pull that out and kind of put that into the idea, and yeah, that all works. And I think the time for that has kind of moved on, and I'm going back to the point around speed of insight and quality of insight in a changing world. So what we talk about is actually inverting that funnel from starting very narrowly, creating ideas in an organization and progressively testing them out, to flip that out and actually talk about, well, let's start much more broadly. There was another point about stop asking questions and start listening, and and one of the other presentations, and I kind of fundamentally agreed with that. And of course, technology has kind of made it much, much easier for us to do this. So the way we think about co-creation is a much bigger idea than just getting people together in workshops. It's this idea of actually actively engaging consumers all the way through the process. Now, Jason also talked about information, and information is free and insights are inexpensive. But what we do live in a world now is where we can go out and start broadly by listening, social media listening, I'm sure there's going to be lots about that, listening to the crowd that's kind of out there. There's people in communities, so we can engage people that are closer to us in our crowd, whether we build those communities ourselves or we're listening into existing communities. And then it might come down to some of these workshops we're actually developing with a really switched-on group of one-percenters who can really influence us, whether that's an expert point of view or a super consumer point of view. And then the final part of this is around validation. Now, my point around validation here is I've missed up two key words here, which are in-market validation. And I think this touches back on Jason's point as well, which is this idea of actually if we're doing things online and we're creating data and we're setting up these systems, then it creates a really lovely loop, because actually as things go into market, consumers start engaging with them, we can capture that data and it starts to feed back into the process. We're creating new communities and new crowds. But my basic principle is about starting broad, listening to what's going on out there in the social web, and narrowing down to your crowd. Now, I've got 5 minutes to go, and I've got about 15 slides to go. But most of them are just pretty pictures, so that's absolutely fine. I think I'm going to flick through that, and I'm going to flick through that, because I said that. I think in terms of what this means for the industry and that kind of funnel that I've talked about, from an agency perspective, is that a couple of things are changing the way that research agencies have to work. I think they are increasingly going to have to become they are becoming or have to be increasingly multidisciplinary. You again talked about, Jason, about IT technologists. And I think it's that combination of technologists, social data scientists, people that are comfortable with big data, people that are comfortable with big ideas, coming together in agencies is going to be the hybrid agency of the future. And increasingly the role of the researcher is about synthesis of these different data sources as we kind of move through the funnel. There's one big impact that we have. I think another thing that co-creation implies that's very interesting is that it actually should, when it works best, be able to harness the best of individual thinking and group thinking. Huge sensation in the New York Times, sort of introverted thinking as opposed to extroverted thinking. And I think co-creation is a really good way of getting that balance between the way individuals think and also bringing people together in groups to create value. I just like that picture, really, but there we go. I've already talked about linking data sources, and I think, but it is very much about that combination. This is going to come up time and come again. That combination of passive data sources, the real data that's out there in the social web that we can kind of bring to us, and active data capture, going out asking the right questions amongst. That's the big future of our industry, is synthesis of data sources. Final thing I'm going to talk about before I get to the 1-minute warning is around co-creation. Very typically associated with product development, concept development, MPD, all of those kind of things. And I think that there is a bigger manifesto for it. So stop thinking only about product development. I think it touches on all of these things. We can bring consumers more directly into the process, listen to consumers more effectively in that broad to narrow perspective in all of these areas: brand equity, communication, service development, developing content with communities and activation. All of these things are relevant. Got my 1-minute warning. And going back to right where I started from in terms of this change and navigating new landscapes, I think where it's really, really relevant is where brands are moving into new landscapes, whether that be looking to build brand equity in new emotional spaces. I think there's a trend at the moment towards brands trying to create lifetime value in terms of the equity by building in more emotional spaces that enable to be more social. But for many brands, it's a new idea, moving into new emotional spaces. Brands are becoming publishers. Brands having to be publishers of content and creators of content more than they have ever been before. It's a new landscape for them. They're used to selling products. Suddenly they're content producers. And as they're entering that new landscape, how can they work with consumers to create better and learn what they're doing in real time? And there was some conversation I overheard, which is around developing middle classes in places like India and China, huge new populations, huge new sets of need states, huge new purchasing power. How can we engage and work with these new audiences and new need states? And the final thing is about my example about finance companies having to compete with technology companies, healthcare companies having to be technology companies, these are new spaces. They can't afford to go through that old process. It takes too long. It's learn from the people that are already doing it and create a more iterative way of doing it. Final 2 slides. I can't believe I got there. Why it matters, co-creation number 1. I love this image. This is about the definition of innovation, what you're looking for and what you find. Life is full of surprises, and I think co-creation opens you up to surprises rather than just the ideas that come through your business. My last slide, alternative fuel, why co-creation matters too. I think there's a great metaphor with energy, and I think the old way that we used to do research and innovation feels like burning fossil fuels to me. You know, you dig it up, it's time-consuming, it's expensive, it's bad for the environment. And I think co-creation offers a way forward in terms of tapping into a huge, powerful source, a renewable source of energy in marketing to really drive it forward from consumers and more collaborative ways of thinking and the social web. There's a huge source of alternative fuel that is renewable and powerful and will probably save the planet too. That's it. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Michael. I even saw that in one of your audiences there what looked like a picture of Superman. So nice to see you encompassing all people. But have we got any questions from the audience for Michael?
Philip.
Sorry, Philip.
Or Michael. Ask Michael too.
I'll go with Philip. How much inevitable pushback do you feel is going to come from the traditional experts? Because now you're talking about taking the customer into the process. These are amateurs. You're rocking the way things are done with this alternative fuel supply. So how much pushback do you expect will come as part of this?
Well, I think a huge amount of pushback from agencies, from traditional creative agencies, and we experienced this 5-6 years ago when we were kind of moving into maybe a little bit more around creating executions and activations with consumers, and there was quite a lot of tension there in that kind of process because it's kind of like, well, we're not the experts, and actually we kind of pulled back a little bit from that. But I think actually what we've seen from an agency perspective increasingly is that they are taking on these principles because I think they're learning that they have to, and clients want them. And those kind of old ways of creating ideas in a small, dark room, sweating them out and pushing them out is changing. So I think there was, but I don't think there will be for much longer. And I think clients really adopt this. One other point, just to build on that, is I do think it is about saying consumers can't do everything and understanding where and when we need to pull in that expert point of view and kind of actually get them working together in the right ways is the way to kind of manage that problem. But you're absolutely right.
Yeah, Tom Van Emmen from Allstate. You stated that the future is synthesis of passive data with active data.
Yeah.
Can you talk to me about synthesis, what you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, okay, well, let me kind of put a stake in the ground here. I mean, I guess when I'm talking about passive data, and it sounds a very negative kind of concept, but I'm particularly talking about information and data that's out there that we can kind of tap into. So what I mean by passive is we don't need to go out and ask for it actively. So I'm particularly talking about social media data in that kind of context. Now, obviously, now Lenny and other people might disagree with me, but having worked a lot with social media data and having been a more traditional researcher in kind of all disciplines, I've always found that social media data on its own, I have problems with it. I feel like I need context. I need to understand how it works through some of that more active, whether it be quantitative data or qualitative data, actually going out and asking people questions and listening to them. So I guess I mean two things by it. One is that I find that I understand social media data has more power when it's combined with other more traditional data sources. And I think the second thing is it's about, if you take my inverted pyramid, I think there's things that you see in social media when you first start looking around a challenge that you just don't spot until you've actually gone through that process a little bit. And then suddenly you kind of realize, oh yeah, that thing that those consumers were telling us in that workshop, you absolutely see that magnified up on scale in that social data. So I think it's about using that social data, that passive data, to help drive your agenda to begin with. But then I think it's also about looping back to validate robustly some things you see on a smaller scale as well. So two different answers there. But I guess that's how I see it.
Any more questions at all? Okay, well, thank you very much, Philip.